about matters of kashrut.
Oh, great.
Is what we're dealing with. So we learned a very famous tshuva of Rav Moshe, who allows from people to go to their parents, let's say, who are not religious, let's say they're Baal Tshuva, because of the concept of kimle, that he knows for sure that the son knows for sure that his father would not serve him non-kosher food. He's going to go out and get separate dishes and buy kosher food. That's the concept of kimle. So according to Rav Moshe, the concept of kimle can be expanded from the original context of a civil court case to a case of potential isser v'heter, prohibition, even nowadays, where we don't even apply the concept of kimle in a court setting. And use it to give credibility to a non-religious relative that they are indeed serving only kosher food. Now, some poskim point out that this is quite a major chidush and cannot necessarily be used as a practical leniency. In addition, Rav Moshe himself applies it only to a case of one who is either elderly or in ill health, a case where no other option exists, and to a very close relative. I wanted to mention the footnote, another potential direction for being lenient, suggested by some poskim in North America, is relevant specifically to ovens, where, as we learned in the Shir Bat Kashrus of electric appliances, some poskim suggest that zeya, which is steam, may not be an issue when one food is not cooked in the oven at the same time as another. And in addition, it is possible that the leniency of stam kelim not being ben yomo, meaning, let's say you go to a relative's house who doesn't keep kosher, and there's a halacha that a regular kli is considered not ben yomo. It's not within 24 hours. Now, we've already learned that any kli that's beyond 24 hours is nosing tam livgam. So it's not going to convey, even if it's got isser absorbed in it, it doesn't give over that prohibited flavor into the food. So this leniency of stam kelim not being ben yoma may be employed in this case, even though Rav Moshe did not accept it being used on a regular basis, to be lenient in using the dishes. Of course, they say one should consult one local rabbi. But we, at least now in this group, can appreciate some of these heterim when they mention it. It's Eino ben Yomo, it's the Zeya, because we're familiar, or we're more familiar with these underlying concepts now. Now, Rav Moshe Sternbuch is alive and well in Yerushalayim. He's the Tshuvas Van Hagois. Suggests another possible direction for leniency in an inquiry from South Africa, that even if the relative keeps non-kosher meat in the house, they can show the package on the meat to verify that it is indeed kosher. He then brings Rav Moshe's suggestion as well and states that one who wishes may rely on it, but concludes that it still requires further analysis. Let's learn this Tshuvas Van Hagois. Nidrashti mi bal tshuva echad kan shehuz min l'tarech etzel aviv.
Yeah, I have to, so 1 second.
So Baal Tshuva asked, he got invited to his father's house, who was not religious. The father promised the son that he would get glad kosher food. And this Baal Tshuva is asking Rav Sternbuch, Shoel, can he eat by his father's house? Im Horav Ne'amonim Lomar, are the parents believed, Shekoinim Mahadrin, that they're going to buy kosher food? O Ne'emar, maybe we should say, She'elam Ne'amonis, Kivin Sha'aba Machalo Shabbos. We learned last week that a Machalo Shabbos before Hesi is not believed. So he says, V'nir l'chalik bezeh. She'ima'av sideh beveso, she'kol ha'basar yovo rak mishchitas mahadrin shalanu. If the father arranges in his house that all the meat is going to be kosher, V'lo nichnas etzlo basar acher klal. And at least during the time where the relative is going to visit, there's not going to be any kosher, non-kosher meat in the house. Halomirtis, the father's going to be afraid. Kishi yizbarash lokach mishchita zu alehichnis basar acher. So Rav Tzurba is saying he likes that situation. He thinks the father could be believed and trusted if he does that thing. But now Rav Tzurba says, "Avale machzik basar acher." He has Farmer John in his refrigerator. V'rak lechavod b'no kona basar mehuder v'nimtzat gam basar acher. Right, and he buys some kosher meat from a kosher butcher. The father could do a switcheroo. So you can't rely on the father. So he's saying the son who's religious or his wife should see a closed package of kosher meat that has, simonim on it that it's kosher l'mahadrin, and they need to see the meat being dumped into a pot, and then they could rely on it.
The pot could be treif?
Well, I'm reading the Tshuvas Vanogos.
He was in South Africa.
I would say that he's makpid, that he wants to have a kosher pot. He's gonna have a kosher pot too. Remember, we read the footnote that a stam kli is eno ben yomo. So if you weren't sure what kind of pot is, you could, based on halacha, you could say that it's but l'chora you wouldn't do it l'chatchila. B'diavad, if they served it, because you wouldn't do b'diavad. So you would try to get them to buy a new pot. But then the Rav Moshe Sternbuch brings up Rav Moshe's tshuva, which we learned. V'chelik beis, heveti divrei agon Rav Moshe Feinstein, shemevi miksubis, v'av shevenu sham shedas hachofetz chaim shebizman hazeh, kimlei rak lahachim v'lo lahakel ein sham. So that concept of kimlei, I know for sure. We only say it lahachmir, not lahakel. So the Chofetz Chaim, says Rav Sternbuch, argued with Rav Moshe. But that's not surprising. Rav Moshe argued with the Chofetz Chaim. Mikom hakom binyanenu, dachshash isru rachuk. Then he says, though, since the chashash isru is not that close, and yesh kan chashash eva v'zilzul b'kovid aviv u'moiro, he understands that there's a din that the son has to have covet and fear for his father. And Ava means we don't want fights. So he says, Nirish ein hechrach lachshosh b'mokom chash Ava le'isser. Va'afilu mazmin avuro dafka. Imakar avi v'imo shebatuch la'olam lo yirmu also. So if the son thinks that the father would never trick him, so l'chora he's saying that you can follow Rav Moshe's advice. Umekel kedas agan Rav Moshe finds in Israel el yesh lo mal lismoch. If someone wants to be maker like Rav Moshe, you can be soymech. Avai b'ksuvisham sherav lo kibel afilo as Rav Papa k'shnei edim. Rav Papa was not accepted like Shnei Edim. He accepted Ishto, Bas Rav Chizda. The Rak Bazai choshev olev kimle v'tzrach bir heite. He says this concept of kimle is not so pashut. They didn't accept Rav Papa as kimle. Your wife can be kimle to him. So he wants to say that that's a complicated issue. Sounds like he doesn't fully agree with Rav Moshe, but says you have Rav Moshe to rely on if you want to be lenient. Rav Yezer Melamed notes that if the food has been verified to be kosher, and the dishes have been koshered properly, or disposable dishes have been used, one may heat the food up in the oven, even if it was not koshered, by covering it properly. Right? Let's say whoever's inviting you is not religious and he orders food from a kosher restaurant Efshar lechamem et ha'ochel b'tanur shelo. He says you can heat up the food in his oven. Bitnai shemacholim notru b'toch tavnit chad pamid. You have to put it in a disposable pan, and you have to wrap it with aluminum foil, not fu b'niyar kesef, k'dei limno knisat edim minator, so that the steam from the oven doesn't enter into the food. V'machamim in the macholim b'microwave. Yesh lanichem b'toch kli kosher. You should also put it in a kosher kli or disposable. Kidugmat kli plastic chad pamid v'letofet ochel im kli b'sakit. Put something over it. K'dei limno knisat edim alam ekor l'macholim. So in that situation, you can heat up the food as well. Another suggestion could be to fabricate some excuse as to why one does not wish to eat the questionable food. Now that may not work if you're invited for 2 weeks. According to the Shtei Chemed, it is permitted to lie in order to prevent revealing one's true halachic concerns for not eating if one is too uncomfortable to explain the problem. Because we're allowed to lie for Shalom Abrios. Says the Shtei Chemed, a person has put a chumrah on himself that he's not going to eat at anybody's house except his own. He has certain chumras. We've learned about all the chumras. Me'ikar adin, you can do certain things, but he wants to follow the various chumras. So, mishum chashash shum isr, v'choyshesh ala kelim. Im yesh, or he's worried about the kelim. Im yesh bazishum pikpuk zilzul anshe ir v'chachamea. But let's say he's concerned that the people in that city follow a certain Rav, and this guy shows up and says, I'm not going to eat here. It's going to be an embarrassment to the Rav and to the city and to the Chachamim there. Yochol edvar sheker lomar shemashu nimna enu mishum chashash Israel mishum siba cheres. He can say I'm a vegetarian. He can say I'm on a diet. Shu b'chlal haheter l'shanos b'nei darchei shalom. The Gemara says somebody comes to your front door and asks, is your wife home? And you know your wife is up taking a shower. You're allowed to say, oh, my wife's not home. The Gemara says that b'feirush, because you're allowed to lie because of darkei shalom, because of tznius. K'moshe kosev b'sefer Yosef Oimetz, Ashkenazi, Yirei shamayim shu orim b'yira, yachol esavi b'chochmaso, shlo yavinu shu mishum prishus. A person could give some kind of reason that he's staying away from this and this food, not because of that he's worried about Isser v'heter, but he gives him some other excuse. Don't be concerned because the Chachamim say that if you tell a lie, it's like you're worshiping Avodah Zarah. You're allowed to change the truth for Shalom. Now, if he wants to avoid damaging his neshama because he doesn't want to eat certain types of food because of chumras that he has, so that's the Shalom of his neshama. If you're allowed to you're allowed to lie because of protect somebody else's covet, you certainly could do it for yourself. Okay. Sefer HaKashrut says the same thing. You're invited to a home where you're not sure about the kashrus of the home. So first of all, you should arrange your visit like to a time where you don't eat, like go at 4:00 in the afternoon. And you can say, listen, or say polite, I don't plan to eat during the visit. You can change the lie, you can lie. Even if it's not the perfect truth. As I know, as opposed to participating in the food. But you shouldn't say a complete lie. Ha'ara kagon, ein anu avi machal zeh anachnu b'deh. You're allowed to say, I don't like that food, or I'm on a diet. They say it's not exactly a complete lie. It's always better to try to avoid that.
You mean in that person's house you're talking about now?
When you go visit a person that you don't trust, you can
Right.
say
You're not talking about in a restaurant, you're talking about in his house.
in his house, in his house,
Fine excuse.
in his house.
You can't tell him I'm kosher and I can't eat here.
If you don't think, yeah, I mean, I guess it would depend on the situation. I think there are certain people that wouldn't be offended by that if they're clearly
Right.
not kosher.
Yeah,
And
if
they
they have
expect
Farmer
it.
John in the refrigerator, that's a different story.
I
Some
think
people have
a lot of
halachas.
Sydney, a lot of these shilas were obviously came up by Balei Tshuva going back to their parents' house. I mean, that's why these questions were asked of Rav Moshe, because there's an Indian of Kavod Ha'av, and it was much more delicate than just going to some guy's house that you're invited to some people that you have nothing to do with.
Of course.
It was much more complicated in those situations. That's why I think they bent over and gave leniencies there. Now, eating at the home of kashrut observant individuals with differing practices. And that, sometimes a person finds themselves being hosted for a meal or extended visit by a family that keeps kosher, but adopts more lenient positions about various halachot or customs,
Problem.
while the one visiting adopts the more stringent position. Is it permitted to eat in such a situation? Or must the one visiting refuse due to concern that he will be served food that he would normally avoid? Although this is a complex question and affects numerous specific halachot, we will mention a few general sources and relevant guidelines here. The first point to note is that the Mishnah Yevamos declares that although Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed about many issues, including specific cases involving yibum, about whether marriage between certain individuals permitted, they permitted marriages between members of the two schools. Which is an amazing thing, because there were certain psaks of Beis Shammai where the person could be a mamzer, but they didn't worry about that because it was one Klal Yisrael. In addition, the Gemara in Chulin notes that despite the numerous disagreements between Rav and Shmuel, Rav insisted that Shmuel would never feed him anything that he, Rav, held was forbidden to eat. It says, Rabbi Elazar Avakoim Kamei Demar Shmuel. Rabbi Elazar was feeding Shmuel. Aisul Kamei Dogim Sha'olu B'Ka'ara. We learned this, a par of food, fish, that was cooked hot, and they put it on a neutral plate, or they put it on a plate that was fleshik. They ate it with the mayonnaise and had milk in it. So remember, this is that concept of not bar not. It's a second, it's no sin tam bar no sin tam, where there was a machlokes, Rav and Shmuel. So when Rabbi Elazar gave it to Shmuel, Yoav lev lo achol. So Rabbi Elazar didn't eat it. Also, the Kamei de Rav. See, Rabbi Elazar followed Rav, was a student of Rav, and Rav paskin that in that case, we don't eat it with kutach. Now we paskin like Shmuel that we do eat it with kutach. Also, Kamei de Rav. Like Hadar Beimar Mishmaitza. So he asked him, did you switch your shita? Like Chasle Lazari the Abba Bar Abad Lasafi Limidi Velosvirli. When Shmuel reported that when Shmuel would serve to Rav, whatever Shmuel served to him, Rav would eat it. And you're not eating what I serve you? So when Rabbi Elazar came to Rav, he said, I understand, Rav, did you change your halacha? Did you now change your mind and now you permit this? He says, God forbid that Shmuel would feed me something that I do not hold to be permitted. Shmuel never fed me such a dish. It means Rav relied on Shmuel, that when he was visiting Shmuel, since Shmuel knew of Rav's shita, Shmuel would never feed him something that Rav held was not kosher. So although it's not entirely clear why Shmuel insisted that Rav would eat the dish in question, despite his position that it was forbidden, it seems clear from the conclusion of the Gemara that Rav felt comfortable eating in Shmuel's home because he understood that Shmuel would never feed him anything that he, Rav, held was forbidden. So the Ramah rules from this Gemara that the practice of Rav is the halacha. Misha noig be'ezedavar isur mikoch shesoiver shedinu. A person has a certain chumrah in kashrus. Or mikoch chumrah sheichbal atzmo. Or he has a certain chumrah for himself. Muter le'cholam acherim shenoagim bo heter. He can go over somebody's house who normally don't follow that chumrah, because he can rely devade lo yachilu davar shu noig bo isur. He's not going to be fed something that he treats as an isur. So according to the Ramah as well, one can eat with another as long as the other observes the rules of kashrus, who does not maintain the same more stringent standard, because it assumed that the host would not serve the visitor food that the visitor treats as forbidden, either as the strict halacha or out of custom. Let's just say, for example, 30 years ago, when it wasn't that completely prevalent that everybody, or 50 years ago in Los Angeles, that everybody ate glad kosher meat. There were a couple of glad kosher butchers. The vast majority of the butchers were not glad. No, but let's say Rav Moshe Feinstein was visiting and he came to your house. You would serve him glad kosher food because you knew that was his standard. That's basically the story with Rav and Shmuel. Rav relied on the fact that Shmuel would feed him, that he understood what Rav's chumras were, and he would make sure if he's going to feed him food that he could rely on the fact that Rav is going to feed him the food of his, even though he knows that Shmuel has leniencies. That's the halacha here of the Ramah. In addition, it seems that the Ramah believes that the visitor should not lower his standard of kashrus in such a case, as if so, the Ramah could have simply said that the visitor may partake of any food offered him, regardless of whether it's presumed that the host would serve him food that he would eat or not. So you can't lower your standard, you have to go up in standard. Now, Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, I hope many of you have gotten familiar with Rav Rimon because he writes an article almost every time in the HaMizrahi magazine. He's one of the upcoming stars. People talk about him as being the next chief rabbi. He's currently the Mord Asra of Machon Lev, where Chaim Sukenik is the dean. You know, it's a Machon where it's an Orthodox college where you can learn science. A lot of Charedim go to school there. Some of you guys remember Chaim Sukenik. He used to live in Los Angeles, went to UCLA. I don't know if Harold remembers him. He used to daven the Rabbi Spurka Minyan. He's now the dean of Machon Lev, and Rav Tzvi Rimon is the Mord Asra there. Susie and I have heard him many times in Israel on the various trips that we've been on with Mizrahi. So he's the posek of Machon Lev, and he's a prominent Rav in Alon Shvut. Concludes from here that the host should try to go out of his way to make the guest comfortable by serving food that is halachically accepted to him as well. However, he writes that if the guest has a specific individual custom that the host does not accommodate, he may forego following the custom when eating elsewhere. So he's saying, Me'ikar Adin, even if a person has a certain chumrah, if he eats somewhere else, he can forego that custom. Now, the ruling of Rav Rimon assumes that the host is familiar with the stringencies of his guest. If he is not, then Rav Rimon would, of course, not permit relying on this assumption. Says Rav Rimon, Adam ochel kashrut regila. Somebody eats regular kashrus. Umarech mishu amakpid al mahadrin. And let's say somebody comes to his home, like in Israel, who only eats mahadrin. Barur, shamarech tzarich litametz alot et ramat kashrut bizman arucha. The host has to try to elevate his level of kashrus when he's hosting his guest. Kach sharech yochal et haramash aleu makpid. So that the guest will eat the regular standard that he's used to. Doma hadover lebalabayis shemazmin adam simchoni leseuda. So, for example, if you invite somebody who's vegetarian to your house, b'noten lo arucha b'sarit, you're not going to feed him fleishik food. He doesn't eat food. So the same thing regarding these stringencies. The host has to make sure that the food that he serves tastes good, of course, and that it's on a level of kashrus that he's comfortable with. And therefore, he raises his own standards of kashrus to satisfy everybody. Rabbi M'Rabanan offers a similar suggestion, though he indicates that in his opinion, and this is a very interesting halacha here, only very specific widespread customs should be adhered to when eating in other people's house, such as glat meat, for those that are careful, and kitniot on Pesach. But other chumrim, should you toivel glasses, remember we had a machlokes, various chumras of, you don't have to, it's for example, glat and kitniot on Pesach is what Rabbi M'Rabanan said you have to worry about. Aforech sheragel lahadir v'liknot motzrei mazonim kashrut mu'deret. Somebody, the guest normally will only eat mahadrin. You should rely on your guest and eat what he serves you. Regular kashrus follows most poskim and follows the klal halacha. There's certainly a mala, a hidur, if you follow certain chumras. Yoter chashuv larbot shalom b'Yisrael chabed et halacha. This is the pnimei halacha, Rav M'Rabanan's shita, that for shalom of Klal Yisrael, we should, you shouldn't stand on ceremony regarding that. Omnam b'minagim nechratzim ubrurim, but customs that are very well accepted. Shonagim etzel kilot shlemot. For example, all of Ashkenazi Jewry follows a certain uvnei otan kilot. Like if somebody was sick, fine, you could eat non-glat food. So on those kind of things, if you're a host, you should be makpid to serve your guest on that level. So if you're invited somewhere on Pesach as an Ashkenazi, they shouldn't serve you kitniot. Hoil umedubar b'minhag yadua. Kayotze bazeh hanohagin lahakpid lechol tamid rak basar chalat glat. Makpid al kagak kashem mitarchim. So when they're visiting, they should be served that as well. Gami ben hanohagim lechol tamid rak yirakot alim migidulim yuchadim lelo charakim. Somebody has a certain minhag to eat only certain vegetables that don't have insects. Like we learned that you have to soak your vegetables in soap and everything like that to make sure that there's no insects. But if they serve you a cooked dish and you see vegetables in there, it's already been cooked and you don't have to you don't have to worry about it. Although he does not discuss them, Rav M'Rabanan may place drinking chol of Yisrael milk, bread that is pas Yisrael, and bread that is yashon, all of which are not allowed in Israel even by the regular Rabbanut, but in the diaspora, but in the Golar, usually certified by the leading kashrus agencies, in this category of well-known customs that one should continue to practice even away from home. So he's advising that if you know that the person uses only chol of Yisrael or pas Yisrael, you should serve that as well. Even if one is stringent, not to eat from certain foods served by the host, is it permitted to eat foods that one does eat that are cooked in dishes used to cook the other foods in question? It would seem that the answer is yes. Based on a ruling of the Ramah, in a similar case of different communities with different practices, as to which fats were forbidden due to the provision of chaylev. Someone, a big gadol paskin for the town of Rhinus, that such and such fat was not prohibited, but in this town it is prohibited. Now, if in the other town where it is considered chaylev and it fell into a pot, you wouldn't be able to eat the pot unless there was a shishim to nullify. Aval ein osrim kalim shel bnei reinis hol v'noagim bo heter. Because reinis had a heter, the kalim are okay. And it could be because, as we learned, stam kalim are considered ein ben yomo, and there's no isser diketam there. Since there are many different halachot situations and opinions about this issue, it's recommended to discuss any particular question with one's regular rabbinic authority. Page 329, kashrut and kashrut certification. The halacha ve'erechod ne'eman b'yisurim discussed above serves as the basis for relying on kashrut certification that a specific product, restaurant, or catering facility is kosher. Although the consumer may not have personally seen the food preparation process, the consumer may nevertheless rely on the certification, which attests that the supervising mashgiach declares that the food is in fact kosher. We're using this same principle of Eirechad B'Yisurim that we've been learning about in Hashgacha. One might wonder, why is a mashgiach necessary in cases where the owner of the catering or restaurant is a religious Jew? Many of our restaurants are owned by Jews. The catering companies are owned by Jews. Why do we need a mashgiach? We've learned all along that if you go into a Jew's house, you can rely on his kashrus. So why do we need a mashgiach? Such individuals, based on the sources we've learned, should have credibility on their own to declare that their food is kosher. Why then is kashrut supervision necessary? So Rabbi Tzurba M'Rabanan explains that since the owner benefits in the form of financial profit from customers who support the business, hashgacha is necessary to ensure that he is not enticed to be less careful about some of the rules. Conflict of interest, right? Hane'emanuta basisit sheyes l'chol Yisrael. The fact that we rely on all Jews that they have ne'emanus, no gas, l'matzavim regilim. That's about a home. You going to visit your friend. You can rely that your neighbor is going to serve you kosher food. But if business is being done, they have to be watched because of financial incentive. The Torah says very specifically itself, be careful about measures and weights. Restaurants, they can profit from substituting non-kosher food with kosher food because it's usually cheaper. Not only that, says Rav M'Rabanan, food preparation is extremely complicated with hundreds of ingredients and factories. So, you always have to have hashgacha if the factory makes it, even if the seller is a shomer mitzvot, he doesn't know what happened in the factories. Omnam. So, but what's the level of supervision? He says there are 4 principles that guide what kind of supervision you should have. When the financial incentive is greater, through trickery, so the more possibility of
higher profits.
Yeah, where he can make more profit, you need more supervision. If there's a greater isser, so for example, you need more hashgacha for fleshik places. Right? So non-kosher meat is a lav in a Torah. So it's less problematic in a dairy place. Not only that, the financial incentive is great. Kosher meat sometimes is double the cost of treif meat. Hashlishi, the third principle, if it's a high volume place, tzarich shapikuach alav yeh yoter kapdani, then they have to be, even more supervision because large numbers of people. K'dei limnoa mechshol rabbi. What's the fourth principle? Aravi'i. K'chol shemazon shalav tzrichim lefakech yoter murkav. It's more complicated. Kidugmat hamazon hatasiti hamechila sarot umeot markivim betosafei mazon. It's made in a factory with hundreds of ingredients and additives. So complexity. Kach hapikuach tzarich liot yoter miktzoi. It has to be more professional. K'dei lakif et kol hashelot shalulot letorah. Now, can a woman be a mashgiach? One interesting application of the principles developed of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim is the context of Hashgacha was discussed in a famous Tzurba by Rav Moshe. According to Rav Moshe, the fact that according to many commentaries, the basis for the principle of Eid Echad was the halachos of Nida. So it permits a knowledgeable woman to serve as a mashgiach as well. There was a widow, the wife of a Talmid Chacham, Ashraya Mashgiach al Kashrut. The husband made his living as a Mashgiach. V'nishara b'lo klum. The widow ended up with nothing. Ve'en la b'ma lefarnes es b'nai yatomim. She has no income. Uvasher hi ishat tznuah. She's a modest woman. V'yires Hashem be'emet. She's a yiras Hashem. V'hi gam chachma u'nuvona u'valat achirud. She's responsible. She's smart. Asher yesh lismoch aleh. You can rely on her for her to fulfill the role of the mashgiach. Oh, so this was the shaila. Could she serve as the mashgiach? So in terms of believing, we believe women. As we learned from when she says, I counted my nida and I'm tahor,
We had this by one of Tzvika's shiurim also, exact Egos Moshe.
Yeah, right. Aval, I remember that. Rabbi Riskin, remember Rabbi Riskin was there, or Rabbi Riskin spoke.
Yeah. Could be.
Right? I think it was in that shiur. So he said, Aval says Rak b'Rabanan kibdikas tchumin nemonos. They want to say there's a Tosfos himself that says she's reliable concerning rabbinic issues, like searching for chametz or tchumim. But if she cannot in her power change the tchum, or it requires extensive effort, there's no nemonos. It has to do with whether or not there's a case where we think that there may be a chazak of Isser. Says Rav Moshe v'kein b'hashgacha al kashrus shebiyada hu shelo laniach la'achil dvar masurim. It's in her power, so it is biyada to prevent mingling of non-kosher products. V'gam lo is chazik Isser. Number two, there's no chazaka that the food here has a chazaka of Isser. The afi mashgacha yetzel echad sheinu ne'eman l'kashrus nami in lachshiv zeis chazik Isser. Let's say you have somebody who's not believed regarding his hashgacha. You still wouldn't say that the food has his chazik Isser unless you find for sure evidence that there's a chazaka of Isser. Lachein afim neima. Even if we're going to say shlo nechshav zeh kibiyada, maybe we'll say she doesn't have the power. Mishum she'efshar mitzad almu shel habaylim. Because maybe the Baalim won't listen to her because she's a woman. Since the food here, there's no chazak of Isser. Listen, this is a kosher butcher stop. So most of the food here is kosher. So because they're going to be afraid that if they're going to smuggle stuff in, so there's no chazak of Yisr. So even though there might be a chisron of Eina Biyada, since there's no chazak Yisura, we can rely on the woman to be a mashgiach. Rav Moshe explains that the foods she is supervising are not assumed to have a chazak of Yisr, since the company is supposed to sell only kosher. Therefore, even if it is argued that it's not in her power to force them to comply with the rules of Hashgacha, she would still be believed when she claims that the food is kosher based on Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, and it would be permitted for her to serve as a mashgiach. Now, we will not discuss specific kashrut certifications or their standards, but will suffice with some important general point. The certification must be given by a rabbinic organization or authority that is authorized to do so, and that's true both in the diaspora as well as in Israel. Consequently, one should not rely on certifications or the kashrus of individual rabbis that are not well known. A person may not be familiar with every recognized kashrut certification around the world. Therefore, it's advisable to consult with a rabbinic authority who can determine whether a specific rabbi or agency is considered reliable or not. And there are two reasons for not relying on individual rabbis that are not well known. Some may not, in fact, offer appropriate supervision. And two, their standards regarding certain issues may be significantly lower than one is used to following. Perhaps they certified meat that is not glatt, while the consumer is careful to eat only glatt meat. In restaurants, simchas, hotels, and everywhere else where food is prepared on site, one should confirm the presence of a reliable and God-fearing mashgiach, or verify that a kashrut certificate is still valid and indeed exists. One should ensure that the kashrut certification by which one is relying, in fact, meets the standards that one keeps for itself. For example, one who's careful only to drink milk that is called Yisrael may not consume some dairy products certified by kashrut organizations whose policy is to be lenient about the issue. This issue is relevant to the Golah for people who drink only Chalav Yisrael, as well as those living in Israel who are careful about this, but visit in the Golah. It's highly questionable whether such individuals are permitted to be lenient. Now, let's say a business acquaintance invites you to go to a non-kosher restaurant, and you'll have a glass of water. You'll have a glass of water there. Are you allowed to go into a non-kosher restaurant? Another issue that arises in the diaspora, less frequently in Israel, is entering a non-kosher restaurant. Is it permitted to do so, to attend a business meeting or join other non-religious family members there? Even if one does not eat anything non-kosher, but only has a cold drink of water or the like, it is still questionable whether it's permitted. Chazal forbade a number of actions due to the concern of marasayin, a suspicious appearance where it appears that one is violating a prohibition, even when that is not the case. One example is the Mishnah in Shabbos that forbids spreading out one's wet clothes on Shabbos due to the appearance that one laundered them on Shabbos, which is forbidden because of malabim. Misha nashru kelev baderech b'mayim ma'alach ben v'nechoshesh. You had to walk through a river. Your clothes are wet, so you can continue wearing them, and you figure by walking in the sun they'll dry off. That's okay. But higia l'chotzer achitzona shotkin b'chama v'lo keneged ha'am. When he reaches his place, it's the outer court, he can take his clothes off, put them out in the sun, but he has to do it privately. Because if people see him, they're going to be concerned that he's being laundering. The Gemara notes that this final reason is permitted to do so in practice, in fact, subject to dispute. The conclusion of Tosfos is that regard to Isser D'Rabbanan one may be lenient, while regarding to an Isser D'Oraisa you have to be stringent. Another example of Marasayin not mentioned in the Gemara is recorded by the Shulchan Aruch within the laws of Basar B'Chalav. Asur levashel b'chalav isha. You cannot cook meat in breast milk. It's not really fleshik, it's not really milchik, it's not considered real milk, but it's marasayin. If it fell into a cooked dish, it's bottle. The Ramon and other commentators of the Shulchan Aruch discuss if and how this halacha should apply to cooking milk and meat, where one of them is not kosher, because the real basar b'chalav only is when both are kosher. Now, based on this, it might seem that entering a non-kosher restaurant should also constitute marasayin, because people will think that one is doing so in order to eat non-kosher food. Nevertheless, Rav Moshe writes that in a case of distress, where one is extremely hungry, it is permitted to enter to eat something that is clearly kosher, like a packaged kosher item or a fruit grown outside of Israel. U'v'davar mutar lechol b'restaurant shemachnisim sham rak machalei chalav, aval hem shel anashim machalei Shabbat. let's say they go into a restaurant, dairy food is there, but it's Machal Shabbos people, owners.
Only dairy food, you mean?
Only dairy food.
I mean, can you walk into McDonald's? That's the question.
No. Well, because what are you going to eat there?
I was saying, okay,
So here, Rav Moshe's, let's say he's going to give a heter that if somebody is dying of hunger, he's not mamish pikuach nefesh, but he's in a lot of distress. So he says, if you go into a milachtik restaurant where the people are not shomer shai, it's a non-kosher restaurant, but it's only dairy. There still could be non-kosher food there. Even to go in, and you're going to only eat something that is clearly kosher, he says you shouldn't do it because of Maras Ayin. He says, Imhu ra'av biyoter, he's very hungry, shemitztar tuva, vein sham makam macher lechol, and there's no other place to eat. Yachol ikanis l'sham lechol dvar ma'yudim l'mutorim. He knows he eats an apple, he eats a banana. Aval tzarch sheyeh b'tzina, d'mamakam tzaduv seder l'goz rabbanon. In distress, and because Maras Ayin is only a rabbinic law, and Chachamim are not goizer in cases of distress and in cases of loss. L'goz rabbanon. V'hainu shelo yumi b'chutz makirav. He should eat in a place where people outside won't see him. D'lifnei elon imtzoyim b'fnim harei Yerush lokech rak dvar ma'yudim l'mutarim. In the restaurant, they see that he's only eating kosher stuff, but the people outside are not going to know that. And in fact, if he sees people that he knows outside, he should tell them. He says you shouldn't go in there if he's not mitzvah tuva. Says the Pnine Halacha, you should not go into a non-kosher restaurant. Especially if you're going with somebody who's eating non-kosher food. In the diaspora, when you're meeting with Gentiles, but in Israel, where most are kosher restaurants, he says you should not go into a non-kosher restaurant in Israel, even with a non-Jew. The story is told about Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky that when he arrived in the United States, he was invited for the Seder night to a family whose kashrut observance was questionable. In order not to insult them, he said that he did not eat gebrachts. A custom in many Hasidic families not to eat any matzah products that have come in contact with water. And could not eat any of the prepared dishes on the table, even though his family custom had been to eat gebrachts. So that's the shinui, right? He was meshana because of Darkei Shalom. From that day on, he ceased to eat gebrachts on Pesach until the end of his life because of that one time that he did that. So I just want to go through this. These were complicated. I think this may have been one of the most complicated sugyas we learned. And I think it's worth going through a review. If you look on page 336, the source for, yes? Yes.
I think applicable to many of our attendees here as businessmen, note 23 on page 335 is actually quite interesting. You might want to review that since it applies to many of us.
Many poskim in the diaspora also allow attending business meetings with Gentiles at non-kosher restaurants based on the logic that since these businesses meetings are quite common, it's no longer considered Maras Ayin in many locations to enter a non-kosher restaurant for such a purpose. Rav Asher Weiss also seems to accept this approach. If it is clear by one's actions that one is there for the purpose of a business meeting and not to eat, after challenging the approach of Rav Moshe. However, in cities where many options exist for high-quality kosher restaurants, it's preferable to arrange for such meetings to take place there if possible. It's also widely accepted today as well to allow stopping at a roadside rest stop and entering a non-kosher restaurant when necessary to purchase packaged snacks and drinks, using the same logic that this does not qualify as Maras Ayin since it's so common. Let's read footnote number 22. Although this is not the subject of this year, it is worth mentioning that eating at a vegan restaurant is also problematic halachically. Despite the fact that such restaurants are quite careful to only serve ingredients from foods that are all natural and should be kosher, there are a number of reasons why one should not do so. These include the possibility of using non-kosher wine in any form, the fact that the vegetables have not been checked for insects, even in cases where the food may be infested, plus the possibility that some foods may be subject to the prohibition of bishul akum. Okay, and let's just go over the sources again.
Bishul Akum is by vegan also?
Yes?
Yeah, okay, I don't know.
Bishul
Because,
akum
you know, someone,
Bishul akum applies to anything that a non-Jew cooks for.
no, there used to be a hechsher
If
on
it's
a
raw,
restaurant.
anything that you
about-
ate raw. Remember, there's no bishul
There was a
akum.
restaurant, there was a restaurant in Los Cienega that had hashgacha.
If it had hashgacha, it had hashgacha.
Yeah, okay. I mean, and it was wrong, they said, because of the wine, they served like, not grape wine, but they had wines that were shaila. But now you're saying the whole cooking was not kosher.
Well, I thought you said it had hashgacha.
I'm just telling you it had hashgacha. I'm not saying how good of hashgacha.
Well, the hashgacha usually also means he turns on the oven, so it's not bishul akum.
I wasn't there for that. I just, maybe you're right. Maybe that's what he did.
So I think they're talking about a vegan restaurant that has no hashgacha. So and some people think that it's okay. So they just went through the issues that might still apply. So wine and bishul akum, and of course insects that we learned. Right. So just Eid Echad, Rashi, the logic, the Torah believes one concerning separating truma, performing shechita, nikkur, and forbidden fat, because if this were not the case, a person would never rely on his household for food preparation. That was Rashi. Tosfos the Eid Echad is a scriptural decree regarding Nida, that she is believed in a case where prohibition has not been established. If it's Lois Chazak Isura, you can believe that she's kosher, even if it's not in her power to rectify herself. And the Ramban believes, even in case of his Chazak Isura. But Shulchan Aruch Paskins, one witness is believed in order to permit a food, but not in order to be stringent and forbid it. The Ramah, in the case of something whose status can be clarified, one witness is believed even in matters of chumrah. If the prohibition has not been established, lo mulsak, one witness is believed even to forbid the item. And when the prohibition has been established, one witness is believed to permit it only when it has the power to change the status. Like he can do the shechita, or he can do the tvila. And the Shita Mekubetza says one who is believed about matters of prohibition need not be investigated. What about relying on the kashrus of non-observant Jews? The Rambam said a person who has been established not to be scrupulous is not believed. The Shulchan Aruch says one who is suspected of eating prohibited foods is not believed. The Ramah says even regarding one whose status has not been established in either direction, one should not purchase anything from him, though if one ends up staying with him, one may eat at his house. Eating permitted foods at the home of one suspected of eating non-kosher. The Taz said it's forbidden due to concern he may feed him non-kosher food. The Shevet HaLevi said it is permitted b'di'evet. The Sdei HaChemet said it's permitted to lie if he's afraid he will insult his host by refusing to eat. The Chakas Binyamin said one who conducts himself like an observant Jew, he davens 3 times a day, keeps a kosher kitchen, is treated as having a presumption for being kosher. And we learned today, may one eat at the home of a non-observant relative? Igros Moshe said yes. If it's a close relative that the person is entirely sure can be believed, if they say that they serve them kosher food. The truest Fanagas, we learned it today, if they show you the seal and kashrut certification, they may believe. Pnei halach, if the food is kosher and kosher disposable dishes are available, the food may be heated up in a non-kosher oven or microwave, as long as the food is covered. And you can bend the truth slightly to explain why you don't want to eat there. What about different practices? Right, Rav, the case of Rav and Shmuel, because Shmuel would never feed him anything that was forbidden. The Ramah held one who has a more stringent standard of kashrut may eat at another's house, who is more lenient, since the host would certainly not serve the guest food that the guest would not eat, as long as the host is aware of that standard. Rav Rimon said a host should try to accommodate the halachic stringency of his guest with respect to make him feel more comfortable. Rav Melamed said you only have to maintain personal stringent customs when visiting others with respect to specific customs like glat or kitnia. Otherwise, you can be lenient and you can eat the food served by the host. So that's for you as the guest as well. That's the chiddush there, that you as the guest, that if you keep glat and somebody serves you're allowed to not eat glat. You can tell your host, I can't eat here because it's not glat, or you make some excuse, I'm on a diet. But if it's another chumrah, you should eat there. The shalom between Yisrael, according to that last posek, is Rav Melamed, overrides those issues, except for, like, let's say Kitniot on Pesach, or we learn Pas Yisrael and Pasakum, right, and the Chol of Yisrael. The Ramot, he said different customs do not create problems with the utensils. Therefore, a visitor is more stringent and still eat food cooked in utensils. He prefer food that he would not eat himself, but others do allow. We said Rav Melamed says a business owner requires hashgacha even if he's religious because of the profit motive. Rav Moshe said a woman can serve as a mashgiach if she's astute and God-fearing. And then we discussed this issue of eating, non-kosher restaurant. Rav Melamed seems to permit going to a non-kosher restaurant for business meeting in the diaspora. Rav Moshe only permitted that, if you were, in trouble, we were starving and in distress. Okay, I think we have, now remember, gentlemen, before Pesach, we will pull out our volume 5s because the laws of bdikas chametz, bitul chametz, and bir chametz is here, and we have not learned them. So we'll leave that for before Pesach. But Baruch Hashem, volume 5 was really something. So 4 and 5, we've finished almost 2/3 of Isser V'Heter. Next is volume 6, where I think we're going to be completing Isser V'Heter. And I will try to get that to everybody before next week. Okay?
Bernie, how much is volume 6? I know it's extra thick.
Oh, it's the same thing. I got it it's $17.
Looks like an encyclopedia you've got there, Chaim.
This is
Wow.
this is volume 6. I put $1 to remind me after I pay Ernie. This is volume 6 to compare, and this is volume 5. Let's see if you can see it.
Your day is no joke.
Wow.
Look, think about how many volumes we've been through 5 volumes.